Okay, year 11, we're going to look at chapter 13 so we can bring a separate piece study to a conclusion. And you can see that by the learning objective for this chapter, we want to look at how Knowles brings some of the ongoing themes to resolution or kind of explores them in depth. And I want to encourage you to think about what you think the novel is trying to say about some of these themes and about particularly Finney as a character and specifically the theme of war. Okay, the first slide that you have in the presentation slides that I gave you last day of class really quickly go through sort of actions that happen, like events that happen in chapter 13. We see the part of the U.S. military moving into Devon campus as the school year comes to a close. We see that the school year has come to an end. We've had a time jump since chapter 12. Chapter 12 is, probably at least 3 months previous to this. All right, we have Jean and Brinker having a conversation with Brinker's father about their military service. We see Jean feeling like his days at Devon have come to an end, not just because of graduation, but also the really important action of clearing out his locker. And then lastly, we find out that Jean goes on to leave school, serve in the military, serve in World War II, but never actually make it to like frontline combat, which he tells us in this chapter that that's kind of what he's hoping for. Okay, and we find out that that's what happens for him. It also happens to be part of the autobiography or one of the autobiographical similarities that Jean has with the author Knowles. Okay, we're going to look at the conversation between Brinker's dad and Jean and Brinker about military service. I know the order is a tiny bit different. I've moved this up to talk about this before we talk about Finney. All right, so grab your books. We're going to be looking at an excerpt from pages 198 to 201 and listening in on the conversation about serving in the military between Mr. Hadley and Brinker and Jean. We're going to start with the paragraph that says, "Dad's here," on page 198. "Dad's here," said Brinker. "I told him to take his cigar down to the butt room. He wants to meet you." We went downstairs and found Mr. Hadley sitting in one of the lumpy chairs, trying not to look offended by the surroundings. But he stood up and shook my hand with genuine cordiality when we came in. He was a distinguished-looking man, taller than Brinker, so that his portliness was not very noticeable. His hair was white, thick, and healthy-looking, and his face was healthily pink. "You boys look fine, fine," he said in his full and cordial voice. "Better, I would say, than those doughboys, GIs I saw marching in. And how about their artillery? Sewing machines?" Brinker slid his fingers into the back pockets of his slacks. "This war is so technical, they've got to use all kinds of machines, even sewing machines. Don't you think so, Jean?" "Well," Mr. Hadley went on emphatically, "I can't imagine any man in my time settling for duty on a sewing machine. I can't picture that at all." Then his temper switched tracks and he smiled cordially again. "But then times change and wars change. But men don't change, do they? You boys are the image of me and my gang in the old days. Does me good to see you. What are you enlisting in, son?" he said, meaning me. "The Marines? Paratroops? There are doggone many exciting things to enlist in these days. There's that bunch that they call frogmen, underwater demolition stuff. I'd give something to be a kid again with all that to choose from." "I was going to wait to be drafted," I replied, trying to be polite and answer his question honestly. "But if I did that, they might put me straight in the infantry, and that's Not only the dirtiest, but also the most dangerous branch of all, the worst branch of all. So I've joined the Navy, and they're sending me to Pensacola. I'll probably have a lot of training, and I'll never see a foxhole, I hope. Foxhole was still a fairly new term, and I wasn't sure Mr. Hadley knew what it meant, but I saw that he didn't care for the sound of what I said. And then Brinker, I added, is all set for the Coast Guard, which is good too. Mr. Hadley's scowl deepened, although his experienced face partially masked it. You know, Dad, Brinker broke in, the Coast Guard does some very rough stuff, putting the men on the beaches, all that dangerous amphibious stuff. His father nodded slightly, looking at the floor, and then said, You have to do what you think is the right thing, but just make sure it's the right thing in the long run, and not just for the moment. Your war memories will be with you forever, and you'll be asked about them thousands of times after the war is over. People will get their respect from you from that, partly from that. Don't get me wrong, but if you can say that you were up front where there was some real shooting going on, then that will mean a whole lot to you in the years to come. I know you boys want to see plenty of action, but don't go around talking too much about being comfortable and which branch of the service has too much dirt and stuff like that. Now I know you. Well, I feel I know you, Jean, as well as I know Brinker here. But other people might misunderstand you. You want to serve, that's all. It's your greatest moment, greatest privilege to serve your country. We're all proud of you, and we're all, old guys like me, we're darn jealous of you too. I could see that Brinker was more embarrassed by this than I was, but I felt it was his responsibility to answer it. Well, Dad, he mumbled, we'll do what we have to do. That's not a very good answer, Brink, he said in a tone struggling to remain reasonable. After all, that's all we can do. You can do more, a lot more. If you want military record you can be proud of, you'll do a heck of a lot more than just what you have to. Believe me. Brinker sighed under his breath. His father stiffened, paused, then relaxed with an effort. Your mother's out in the car. I'd better get back to her. You boys clean up. Those shoes? He added reluctantly in spite of himself having to. Those shoes, Brink, a little polish? And we'll see you at the inn at 6. Okay, Dad. His father left, trailing the faint, unfamiliar, prosperous aroma of his cigar. Dad keeps making that speech about serving the country, Brinker said apologetically. I wish to hell he wouldn't. That's all right. I knew that part of friendship consisted in accepting a friend's shortcoming, which sometimes included his parents. I'm enlisting, he went on. I'm going to serve, as he puts it. I may even get killed, but I'll be damned if I'm going to have that Nathan Hale attitude of his about it. It's all that World War I malarkey that gets me. They're all children about that war. Did you ever notice? He flopped comfortably into the chair that had been disconcerting his father. It gives me a pain personally. I'm not any kind of hero, and neither are you, and neither is the old man, and he never was. And I don't care what he says he almost did at CH13. He's just trying to keep up with the times. He probably feels left out, being too old this time. Left out? Brinker's eyes lighted up. Left out? He and his crowd are responsible for it, and we're going to fight it. I had heard this generation complaint from Brinker before, so often that I finally identified this as the source of his disillusionment during the winter, this generalized, faintly self-pitying resentment against millions of people he did not know. He did know his father, however, and so they were not getting along well now. In a way, this was Finney's view, except that naturally he saw it comically, as a huge and intensely practical joke, played by fat and foolish old men bungling away behind the scenes. I could never agree with either of them. It would have been comfortable, but I could not believe it, because it seemed clear that wars were not made by generations and their special stupidities, but that wars were made instead by something ignorant in the human heart. And that last sentence that I just read is a really important quote that we're going to come back to when we talk about the theme of war. But quickly, as a mention about serving in the actual armed forces in World War II, we need to point out that Gene is now at peace or ready for enlisting now. It's been something he and his peers have been wrestling with throughout the book, and it's the most up close view we've had is through Gene. We've also seen Finney wrestle with enlisting. We've seen Brinker, Brinker and Lepper's consideration of it, but we see now that Gene has accepted it and is ready to move forward. We need to notice that both Brinker and Gene are wanting to survive the war, survive their military service, and this is their highest priority. This is in contrast to Brinker's father's view, which he tells them that they need to consider the long run. They need to think about what their war memories will be. And he wants them to have a, quote, military record you can be proud of, that people will respect them for, okay? So in his mind, it's like, not like, how can I, kind of not get my hands dirty, not get killed, but his view is much more heroic. What can I do? How can I, have a heroic legacy when the thing is finished? Obviously, Brinker's father served in World War I and survived, but he has a much more patriotic, nationalistic, honor and duty mindset, and Brinker and Gene are looking at it, I've got to do it. How can I survive it? And one thing that I've done in class with this is ask students to discuss which view between Brinker's father and Brinker and Gene of service is more honorable, whose view is more sensible, and which do you relate with better, okay? We're not in class, but those are some things you can think about as you read this passage. In your opinion, whose view do you find more honorable? Whose view do you find more sensible? Whose view do you resonates, or do you find more relatable? Okay, and then the second question after you think about that is as someone who lives in a world where tyranny has been fought against and liberties protected, meaning you live in a, at minimum post-World War II world, then that's not to say that other wars since haven't been fought, but that's the one being addressed here in this book. Which view do you appreciate between Brinker's father's view and Gene and Brinker's view of military service? Which do you appreciate between the two views as someone who lives in a world that has benefited from men and women willing to fight, to sacrifice their lives, and face the enemy? We're going to carry on and move on to Gene's thoughts about Finney. And this is the part where we're going to skip around just a little bit. So turn back a page to page 197. We're going to read a little excerpt from that page, and then we're going to skip to page 202. Okay? On page 197, near the top, he says, "I had to be right in never talking about what you could not change, and I had to make many people agree that I was right. None of them ever accused me of being responsible for what had happened to Phineas, either because they could not believe it or else because they could not understand it. I would have talked about that, but they would not. and I would not talk about Phineas in any other way. Here we've got Jean talking about sort of the aftermath of the trial that happened in chapter 11, where he says he was never accused for being responsible. And his thought is that people didn't believe and didn't understand it, okay? Meaning what had happened between he and Finney. And I want you to see the connection between these two words, okay? They didn't believe and they didn't understand. And think about the passage in chapter 12 that you've explored in the passage-based question that covers this last conversation between Finney and Jean, that how many times Finney and Jean both repeat the words believe and understand, believe and understand. That Finney believes Jean's explanation for why the limb was jounced and what had happened up in the tree, and kind of understanding what had happened. Okay, that Finney is the only one who believes and understands, and everybody else doesn't get it, doesn't understand, and wouldn't believe it. He also says that, I have a quote from the paragraph that I just read, that nobody would talk to him about it, that he wouldn't talk about Phineas in any other way. And so his claim, this is the wrong page number, sorry, this is from 197. His claim is that nobody ever talked to him about Phineas after that night. Okay? And then another quote is, that is why I couldn't say anything or listen to anything about him, because he endured so forcefully that what I had to say would have seemed crazy to anyone else. He talks about how he'd only talk about Phineas in first person, and or not first person, sorry, present tense, because of the idea of Finney, his spirit kind of enduring on in Jean. So one thing that I like you to think about is we get just Jean's perspective here. His perspective is he's got all these high ideas about what transpired between he and Finney, the understanding that they had come to, and kind of his own personal resolution with Finney, and then nobody else gets that, and so nobody else can enter into a conversation with him about that. But in class, I would have you talk to a partner and ask, why might some other what are some maybe other perspectives or other reasons be that people aren't talking to Jean about Finney after the trial? There's plenty of explanations on this one. Jean's kind of all philosophical in his head about this high understanding that he and Finney came to before Finney died, and it's kind of sacred territory. Nobody else will get it. But the other perspective on it is that the other guys that were involved in that evening are probably feeling really sheepish, somewhat responsible for what happened to Finney. Because of the trial, Finney gets upset, Finney runs out, falls down the stairs, and in the aftermath of the surgery afterwards, dies because he's having his bone reset in his leg. And Finney is Jean's best friend and roommate, so it stands to reason that there's not a bunch of people coming up and saying, hey, about that thing with Finney, or hey, let's talk about how Finney died or what happened in the tree. It becomes something that people likely are too embarrassed to talk about. Maybe they are trying to be respectful and sensitive to how Jean might be feeling, or their own part in what had happened. you know, recognizing that, man, they all had some fault in it. But when you have someone, you know, an acquaintance or a friend that's dealing with the loss of someone close to them, you don't, you know, you're respectful of their grief. You don't just walk up and like, so hey, how about that best friend of yours that just died? Let's talk about that. You know, people tend to sort of shy away and you know, treat it very carefully when someone's grieving. So there could be other explanations for why people aren't talking to Gene about Finney, but this is his explanation, and there's lots of times where we have to realize that Gene gives us the Gene perspective and not necessarily a perspective that is the whole picture. Okay, let's stop here with this video, and then the next video will carry on with Finney's character.